So I have 140 miles here from Fort Bragg. I'm feeling pretty good. Only thing is, the longest ride I've done is 148 miles down from LA to San Diego, but that was 6,000 feet less climbing, not carrying all this gear, and not putting in 2 days like I already have. Maybe I'm not as confident anymore. Mendocino was my first stop 10 miles in to give me an idea of how I was feeling. Marking the first third of the journey, I hoped the next 35 miles would go smoothly to Point Arena. Right before the halfway mark, Sea Ranch is always a required stop on Highway 1. Fort Ross marked the end of riding under 100 feet above sea level, surprisingly marking 6,000 feet of climbing over these first 85 miles. The hardest climbs waited for me the next 10 miles, making it to the Russian River. My last stretch of coastline was some of the prettiest, ending in Bodega Bay. The final 30 miles was the strangely fastest, ending in Petaluma. Overall, it was hard to imagine I almost rode as many miles on my last day as I did the first two. It was rise and shine. Back to my 6 a.m.-ish start time to get in the most sunlight, with many destinations to check off. I was hopeful the fog would eventually back away like it did the day before, and also not to be roadkill sent off to Restoration Hardware, as some of the bridges don't have a lot of wiggle room, keeping my head on a swivel early on, but I remembered I could duck off the highway, taking me through the quieter settings of Caspar, that I also went into the depths of the forest the year before, and now I would have taken the Highway 1 bypass on Point Cabrillo to visit the lighthouse if I wasn't as short on time, but even the extra 150 feet of elevation kept me away, knowing I had plenty of more views to come, more focused on the next turnoff, entering Mendocino a little ahead of the coffee shop opening, allowing me to wander around this town on the National Register of Historic Places, founded on Pomo land back in 1852, retaining its quaint feel lined with local merchants, as the goodbye is memorable with Mendocino bordered by Big River. There was hope with the fog starting to burn off, needing all the help I could get until my next stop in 35 miles, with the veil of opacity slowly peeling off, revealing backup options if I hit the wall, as constantly I would have to climb out of these dips, with the number of waterways I was crossing too many to count, especially when you're distracted by the viewing opportunities, seeing my strategy choosing the steel bike for day 3 paying off, keeping momentum better on all these rollers, especially seeing how my new tire had far less wobbling, as the first 85 miles takes place under 340 feet above sea level, dipping down to exactly that, going inland to cross the Navarro River, over this more modern bridge, leading to my largest climb elevation-wise in the first half of the ride, taking it slow, even averaging 5.5%, giving the benefit of looking down on the shoreline, as the beauty was just getting started, with the road far emptier after passing Highway 128. That's not a feeling you'd expect in an area that's such an eyeful, with my concentration interrupted rolling into Elk, that was a 19th century logging town, and with its beaches, another reason to overnight here, enjoying the progress I've been making. No ocean, but it's moments like this where it's been quiet for minutes, you have the road to yourself. Just bliss. I wasn't so worried about the clouds, seemingly coming in and out like patchwork, starting to feel good enough to pick up the pace slightly, since the highway was off the coast for a few miles, going through Manchester like a breeze, marking just 100 miles left in this journey, and not too far from my next stop, as the haze didn't dip my spirits coming into town, rolling into Point Arena, Spanish for Sandy Point, feeling welcomed rolling in, with this town's roots predating the Civil War, even with its own theater with only 500 residents, stopping into Franny's for a coffee and pastry to stay ahead of schedule, as the sign coming out of town was a bit of a misnomer, with Highway 1 feeling stretched out for the next hour, riding a bit off the coast, passing only the occasional vehicle, and the flavor change crossing over Schooner Gulch, leaving my last significant stretch of fog for the rest of the day, giving the ride some beautiful clarity. More landmarks started to emerge, like Fish Rock Road, and coming up on Anchor Bay highlights why I like riding the North Coast more than Big Sur, is that you're never too isolated between towns, with a bit more variety of landscapes and a bigger footprint from a century ago, while still making great progress with these subtle undulations, now entering the relaxed vibe of Walla. That was a noteworthy point of this trip, being my last town passing through Mendocino County, as the Walla River looked inviting if I had a kayak for me, and in the middle, marking my entrance into Sonoma, immediately biking through one of my most anticipated spots in the architecturally noted community of Sea Ranch, first turning into what's always been a required stop on Highway 1, where you're free to enter one of the most unique structures you'll find, as visiting the chapel has always been important, with all my journeys going through being arduous ones, and having a moment to reflect helps ground me on what I'm trying to accomplish. Sea Ranch is stretched out over 6 miles, having studied about this 1960s development, led by a number of influential designers of the time, with a modern aesthetic that blends with the landscape, and I couldn't help myself without another stop, going to the center of it all, to the lodge, as I wasn't turning down coffee at this point, in such a distinct setting, where you could learn more about its history, and throw on music if you understood the technology. And I mean, should I just end my ride here? I made a critical decision grabbing a croissant on the way out, followed by what Sea Ranch probably looked like before its development, with most of the land serving ranching for decades, as Stewart's Point is not only part of that era, but also the halfway point of this trip. That also happens to be my favorite place to eat in the area, and there's other reasons as well. But I was afraid taking in a meal here might cause me to freeze, so I was off soon to start the second half. As you notice over the next 17 miles, the ride having a different character, either being right up on the waterfront or rolling through the foliage typical on the Sonoma coast, with traffic picking up a little too, while making good progress, as the highway is now fronted by more and more establishments and campgrounds with excellent beach access, with another 60s landmark in the Timber Cove Resort not too far, and its 93-foot Buffalo Peace obelisk seen well down the coast. Maybe one day I'll make a video about all the places I wanted to stop at, but for now I was thankful for the efficiency of the highway as the terrain increased its banking, as Fort Ross's appearance was timely for a water refill, knowing entering the state park is free for cyclists and also worth a few minutes visiting, as one of the most interesting historical spots in California. Hard to imagine this Russian outpost was established in 1812 and now largely reconstructed with heavy damage from the 1906 earthquake, with around 300 people living here at its peak, But as agriculture waned and hunting depleted the stock for the fur trade, this outpost was sold to John Sutter in 1841, leaving a big what if had the Russians discovered gold in their time here. I made sure I was packed in neatly, knowing leaving Fort Ross was a significant moment, as for the first time today, having sustained climbs within the next 10 miles. And while not the toughest of climbs on paper, I'm glad the twinge of cramping wasn't there, seeing that maybe the Russians didn't settle further south because of these cliffs, nor having the job security of highway repair, as this section is not only one of the biggest highlights of the trip, but one that is done best on a bike, especially since cars aren't allowed to pull over anywhere on this stretch, where on one hand, you feel like you can fall into the ocean, and on the other, a view you can only get while riding. These were great conditions to experience Sonoma, and these other famed roads were tempting as well, as this perfect weather felt like a moment in time that soon moves at a different scale in the funnest descent of the day down Russian Gulch, experiencing a fun back and forth of speed until gravity gave me a chance for a status update. That was fun, but not worth this. The highway was starting to get crowded, with traffic allowing me to comfortably take in these views, coming up on the mouth of the Russian River, meaning I was entering the last town on its north side in Jenner, where I conveniently needed more than standard H2O, in good shape, but feeling a layer of fatigue settling in, but motivated to get moving, about to hit a milestone, crossing the... I get it. With Willow Creek, a gravel option up the river, but I stuck with the highway with less strain despite this climb, although my bike was dirty enough for it, as at the top, the terrain the next 10 miles was like the first half of the ride, not to mention the minimal foliage as well, but this stretch puts you lower and closer to the coast, where you definitely want to take a few moments, as I have always loved returning to these surroundings, not to mention the legendary Coleman Valley Road, with that climb connecting this area even further. But I was feeling a mood shift with more people around, rolling into the well-known town of Bodega Bay, and while the wind has been helping me most of the way down the coast, it was unfortunately stagnant at the shop, as the Sleepy Bay is well known for its emergency preparedness for earthquakes and tsunamis, which might explain why the highway feels engineered for higher speeds here, making it feel a little less of a cycling paradise. So I decided to take one last diversion off the highway, heading into the separate town of Bodega that has more of a footprint from the 1850s, also including ones from well-known suspense movies, as this church will be forever remembered in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, with the town proudly nodding to it, while thankfully not going all the way to recreate it. Getting back into Highway 1 led me to my final quarter century of riding, that looked promising with the flattish landscape, but I felt pressured to push it so drivers wouldn't come up on me too fast, feeling it way more fighting up these short inclines, as there's plenty of farmland, but little space for bikes, and if I was headed south, I would have taken this cut off, instead continuing on to Valley Ford. There was a stop on the North Pacific Coast Railroad starting in the 1870s, and also my last refuel for the rest of the ride, eager to finish off at a relaxing pace when there was a shoulder, then pumping over 20 miles per hour when there was less than some, as closing in on the most linear part of the ride, both geographically and emotionally, feeling like I had pushed all my chips in, not even investing a moment saying goodbye to Highway 1, with twinges in my legs arriving as precursor to cramps. Why me? Why now? If I was a better rider, I'd try inserting more plot lines here. Not having the depth of discovery of the Lost Coast, wondering if my body wouldn't be giving out if it didn't know I was on my last few miles.
Less than 10 miles. My legs are checking in with me and they're telling me they want a cramp. Please.
I didn't expect much fanfare making it into Petaluma. Even as welcoming as this 19th century town is, as I felt riding through downtown like just another cyclist inhabiting the road, with the adventure at the end leaving a far bigger mark physically than emotionally, making this accomplishment feel absent. The next day didn't bring many answers to what this trip meant. Trying to get into a more normal routine, like being able to sit down and enjoy a meal. And even serendipitously seeing Mike pass the next morning didn't close this universe, as I went directly into reacclimating, feeling strange transitioning into a more fabricated world, with the fun disconnected from the adventure I just left behind, and visiting the spot that played a part in our statehood. Should have tied things together more, back in a time when California was more vacant like the Lost Coast. But even getting back on the bike the following day left me in a fog, at least laughing it took until now to get my first flat, as riding with this golden morning light wasn't getting me closer to resolution. Almost a year later, we were coming down the coast. With a little more time to explore, important that I return to Shelter Cove with my family. And this time not just traveling through 300 miles in 3 days, but taking in the Lost Coast. Coming to some closure that in my time I've ridden through some iconic scenery, but it doesn't matter much unless you live in the moment and have people to share it with, as life can go by too quickly unless you let it land.